Masai.
The Masai.
The Masai.
Masai.
The Masai.
The Masai.
The Masai.
The Masai. Low-carb influencers love pointing to the Masai, an ancestral tribe that ate a high-fat diet of milk, meat, and blood as proof that our ancestors thrived on low-carb diets.
Masai eating mostly meat, mostly dairy, mostly blood from their cattle, if not exclusively. And they found that the Masai were much healthier.
But the thing is, they never show you the other ancestral tribes, like the Tsimane. When you compare the Masai to the Tsimane, who eat almost the exact opposite diet of fruits, roots, and vegetable, as well as wild game, the whole low-carb ancestral narrative starts to look very different. And when you take things even one step further, and you look at the different metabolic markers between the two groups based on published data that we have, their activity levels, and their cardiovascular data, you start to see a pattern that very few people in the low-carb nutrition world talk about. In today's video, I'm going to show you the dietary differences between the Masai and the Tsimane. One, extremely high in fat, and the other, extremely high in carbs. Two, how each tribe's health outcomes compare, especially when it comes to blood pressure, cholesterol, and cardiovascular health. And three, the practical lessons that you can use to build a diet that's specific to your metabolic needs. Now, before we get started, much of the work that I do helping people to cut through the conflicting nutrition advice starts with understanding which foods support your individual physiology. To make that easier, I created a free pro-metabolic diet calculator and food guide that helps you to build a diet tailored to your unique needs. You can grab it using the link in the description. All right, to start off here with this comparison, I want to look at the Masai first. So we're going to take a look at the Masai, the population that was studied, their diet, their physical characteristics, and then we're going to see their cardiovascular results. And then we're going to do the same thing for the Tsimane. And then we're going to compare the two different outcomes and see how they actually look, this really high fat versus this really high carb dietary setup. So the Masai data we have is older data from a researcher. His name is George Mann. And George Mann's papers come from 1972. Now, the thing to keep in mind with this comparison, and to be fair, is that George Mann's data is autopsy studies. So they're looking at people who had died, and then they autopsy their cardiovascular system. Whereas when we look at the Tsimane, these are going to be living people. So it's not an apples to apples comparison per se, but it can give us a rough idea of what's going on, or this is the best information essentially that we have in terms of what's going on with these two different populations in terms of their overall health, particularly their cardiovascular health, because that's what the researchers were focused on in these two papers. So in George Mann's studies, the population he looked at was a total of 50 people, 50 men actually, who had died. The age was from 10 years old to 60 years old. Now, interestingly, most of the population that had died was less than 60 years old. And we can see where their deaths had come from. So 15 of these men had died from combat, 13 from infection, 8 of them from cardiovascular and renal diseases, 6 of them from accidents, 3 of them from cancers, 2 of them from an intestinal obstruction, 2 from suicide, and 1 from a diabetic coma. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, some of the cardiovascular and renal deaths that we see here aren't necessarily from the typical cardiovascular diseases that we would see in Western populations like coronary heart disease. These are more infective diseases like syphilitic heart disease and things like this. So that's one thing to keep in mind that makes just to be fair around the data. These aren't like they had a heart attack. They actually didn't find high amounts of heart attacks in this population, but we'll talk about their atherosclerosis. Now, in terms of the Masai diet, there's multiple papers that get pulled together to try to understand it. But pulling those papers together, I have a couple quotes here that we'll look at. So we have a quote here, and this paper the paper that pulled some of these together is The Traditional Masai Dietary Practices and Their Inapplicability to Modern Carnivore Diets, a Narrative Review. Now, they first talk about a paper from Briss et al., which I've also read Briss's paper, but they summarize it nicely here. They say Briss et al. Reported that milk was the primary dietary staple, with men drinking 3 to 5 liters per day. When milk supplies dwindled for 4 to 5 months per year during dry seasons, the Masai supplemented their diet with fresh blood mixed into milk. They also consumed large quantities of roasted or boiled meat from cattle, sheep, or goats during these times, with meals estimated to include 1.8 to 2.3 kilograms of meat in a single sitting and 2 to 5 kilograms of meat on days when cattle are brought to market, as well as celebration days. So Most of the year, or at least half the year, the Maasai were subsisting mainly on milk. When you go through these studies, their milk composition is actually very different than the milk composition of Western cows. They have a higher fat percentage, a higher cholesterol content, and typically a lower carbohydrate content in their milk. And then for a portion of these years, they actually went to a higher meat intake because of a lack of supply of milk from the cattle, and they usually would have the meat from sheep or goats, and they tended to avoid killing the cattle as much as possible. So that and it's only a portion of the year that they would have this very high meat intake, which actually counter to some of the carnivore narrative where the diet is actually mainly meat. And then some of the concerns talked about in carnivore diet is like, hey, don't have too much dairy. So their diet was mainly focused on dairy, and meat was like the subsistence food when there wasn't enough dairy left over. Now, and the other thing to keep in mind, this was mainly for men, and this was also mainly for men that were in the Murin cohort. So the Murin cohort, or the Murin time frame, is a time frame with the Maasai. I think it's from like 15 to age 30, somewhere around there, where they are considered the warriors, and they only go on a diet of meat, milk, and blood. However, when they're younger, and then after that time frame, the diet can be different than that. It doesn't only have to be meat, milk, and blood. So that's something that's important to consider. And so I have a next quote here, and we're going to look at what do the women and children do. So they say Nessel reported that meat was less frequently consumed by women and children, typically 2 to 5 times per month, depending on the season and livestock availability. Non-pregnant and lactating women obtained 52% of their daily energy intake from dairy, and maize became an alternative staple when milk was scarce. However, fruits, vegetables, and pulses were rarely eaten. So they would have corn, and they would have milk for women and children mainly, and there wasn't as much meat consumption as we saw with the men. So this is not a typical carnivore diet. This is actually kind of more like a somebody doing like a full peat diet with no carbs, right? They're just doing only having milk, or they're really focusing on milk. And then in times where there's not enough milk, then the women and children add corn, but the men would typically add or would add large quantities of meat. Now, in terms of what the breakdown of the diet was macro wise, we have another quote here. They say nutrition intake among the Maasai indicates that their traditional diet is high in fat and protein and low in carbohydrates. Early reports indicated that the adult Maasai men and women consume between 2,500 and 3,000 calories per day, with 33 to 47% of the energy derived from fat, 27 to 40% from protein, and 13 to 40% from carbohydrates. Subsequent investigations indicated higher fat intakes, closer to 60 to 67% of total calories, and mean cholesterol intakes of 500 to 2,000 milligrams per day. The mean fatty acid composition of the diets of adults have been reported to be approximately 68%, 28%, and 4% saturated monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, respectively. So 68% of the diet was saturated fat, 28% was monounsaturated fat, and 4% was polyunsaturated fat. The other things they say here, and this is something interesting to note about the Maasai, is that even though they were on their carnivorous diet, they had meat consumption at different periods of time, there was rank nutrient deficiencies in the population. Now they also had infections, so that's something to keep in mind. But the diet wasn't sufficient in certain vitamins and minerals. And so they further say here, the traditional Maasai diet has also been reported to be devoid of added salt, meaning requirements to the consumption of animal blood. Micronutrient analysis indicated that iron and vitamin C intakes were low, reflected by anemia prevalence in about 40% of children under 5 years of age and 22% in adult women. So a large percentage of children and women are actually anemic in this population. And then the diet isn't appropriate for certain vitamins and minerals. Now, when we look at this all together, the breakdown of the Maasai diet, it's about 2,500 calories per day, roughly 2,500 to 3,000. I took the 2,500 here. The men were probably higher because the Tsimane cohort that I looked at, or the studies on the Tsimane, talked about a 2,400 calorie intake per day. So they're getting relatively close comparison in terms of their calories. Now their macros are very different. So the Maasai here have about 13% carbohydrate. So that's going to be about 80 grams per day. That's pretty close, especially with their activity levels. Or it's at ketotic levels almost. 50 grams per day, but their activity level is massive. We'll see that in a second. Their fat intake was about 66% fat, which would be about 183 grams per day of fat. And it was about 124 grams of saturated fat, 51 grams of monounsaturated, and 7 grams of polyunsaturated. I calculated those off the total fat intake the 66%, giving me the 183. And then I took the percentages that I got from the study, the 68% saturated, 28% mono, and 4% poly. The protein intake was about 130 grams per day. And again, this is from dairy products and from milk product, from the meat products. So this is what the diet looks like here for the Masai. Now, in terms of the Masai's physical characteristics, the Masai tended to be on the leaner side overall, quite a bit on the leaner side. From the Mann study, they actually show the Masai BMI, at least with I'm using from Mann's study because I'm going to go through Mann's data, but the BMI was about 19.4 kilograms per meter squared. So they were towards the underweight category overall. The Masai actually had a low blood pressure. So this was also from Mann studies. A Mann et al. Conducted a cross-sectional study involving 400 Masai adolescent boys and men aged 14 to 55 years who were recruited from several communities in the region. Um, they basically said the study used standardized clinical protocols. Participants were examined after a resting period and blood pressure was measured. And they took duplicate readings to ensure that they were accurate. Hypertension was defined using thresholds of systolic blood pressure greater than 160 millimeters of mercury and diastolic blood pressure greater than 100. What they found was that only 6 men exhibited blood pressure greater than 160 millimeters of mercury, and 5 had diastolic readings at or above 100 millimeters of mercury. So most of the men, so out of the 400 Masai men, only 6 of them were actually considered hypertensive here. Now, 160 on systolic and 100 on diastolic is pretty there's a pretty high bar set there. It could be lower. Like the current standards would be if you were greater than 130 or you'd be in pre-hypertensive area, but greater than 140. So this level is a bit higher, but overall, we're not seeing a high amount of hypertension in this population. Also, something interesting about the Masai and why they've been studied so much is that their cholesterol levels are typically quite low. So this is a graphic showing the cholesterol change in the Masai from about 15 years of age to 65 years of age. And the average cholesterol level was about 135 milligrams per deciliter. So that was their total, which is significantly lower than the cholesterol levels that you would typically see in Westerners, which they compared here with US males averaging around 220, somewhere between 220, 240, and in US females as they age going over the 240 mark. So much lower than Western counterparts. Now, one thing that's interesting here, and this is a bit of a tangent, the Masai actually have some degree of genetic adaptation to their diet. And they tested this in different studies. So Briss et al. Tested this, and then Mann et al. Had tested this. And basically what they had found was that the Masai lower their production of cholesterol from their liver in the face of a high dietary cholesterol intake, more so than Western counterparts do. So when the Masai get a high amount of cholesterol in the diet, they drastically decrease their cholesterol production, which allows them to keep overall lower lipid levels. And this is actually something that's very interesting to consider because it would indicate that they have some degree of adaptation to their diet, which may make this type of eating pattern not necessarily reproducible in another population that doesn't have this adaptation. So that's one thing to keep in mind here. Now, the other thing is the Masai were extremely active. So they had an energy expenditure here, they say, of 2,500 calories above basal requirements. They say here this is approximately the energy expenditure of running a marathon. So they had and I think this energy expenditure was largely for some of the Murin cohort, so the young men who were a part of the warrior groups. But either way, they looked at their energy expenditure and it was quite high overall. And then the Masai, as I mentioned, were also riddled with infections. They say the Masai experienced a high prevalence of infectious disease and parasitic infections, which significantly influenced their lipid profiles and cardiovascular risk. Common diseases include malaria, tuberculosis, brucellosis, and gastrointestinal parasitic infections, which have been linked to the consumption of raw meat, milk, and blood, as well as poor sanitation and contaminated water. These infections contribute to significant morbidity, with malaria affecting up to 35% of African pastoralists and high reported prevalence of conditions including diarrhea and pneumonia among children. So they have their ancestral diet, but they also have quite a bit of infections. So that's the whole profile. That's the whole picture of the Masai. They're highly active people. They have a very high fat, very low carbohydrate diet. Their body weights typically fall in a lower BMI category. So they are either underweight or normal weight. And then they also have typically low cholesterol levels and low blood pressure. So they don't have high cardiovascular risk factors from weight, blood pressure, or cholesterol. So the question is, what does their cardiovascular profile look like? Did they have atherosclerosis? Did they not have atherosclerosis? What are we looking at? So this is where the Mann data comes in on the 50 men that we looked at. And so this is from Mann. Mann says the present data do not confirm either of Biss statements. So Biss et al. Had done a study on the Masai and said that they didn't have atherosclerosis, but that was only on a population of 10 men, an autopsy of 10 men. So Mann further says we find that the Masai vessels do not do, or we find that the Masai vessels do show extensive atherosclerosis. They show coronary intimal thickening, which is equal to that seen in elderly Americans. The unique anatomical feature of the Masai material is that the coronary vessels enlarge with age so that the lumina are not compromised by intimal thickening. So in the same paper, Mann et al. Says the Masai don't see very many heart attacks. They didn't see very many heart attacks, at least based on EKGs. However, on the autopsy information, when they're looking at the hearts of these men and the blood vessel of these men, they actually find quite a bit of atherosclerosis, and it's on par with elderly Americans, elderly Westerners. What they say is that the interior portion, the lumen of the vessels, actually just expands as they get older, so that it's not compromised by the atherosclerosis that they have. So going on here, I pulled some of the graphics from the paper, so we can actually look and see what's going on in terms of their atherosclerosis. So this first graphic here looks, so sudanophilia is a staining technique to see how much lipids are in the vessels. And we can see the arch, thoracic region, abdominal region, and all regions. And this is of the aorta. And we can see that around 30 years of age, the Masai start to increase their the amount of lipids present inside their aortas. So you see a significant increase, and then that tends to go upwards as they get older. So they have a little bit when they're younger, it decreases till they're 30, and then they start to see an increase of atherosclerosis until they're 60. Then the next thing we start to see here is you see the frequency of fibrosis, like high grade severe fibrosis in the arteries, which would be indicative of high amounts of atherosclerosis. And you see by age 40, 50, and 60, you're seeing high amounts, at least in these autopsies, of severe fibrosis amongst the Masai, which rules out the idea that they don't get atherosclerosis because of their ancestral diet. They're actually getting significant atherosclerosis. Now, the next graphic that we see here is they plotted the Masai in terms of the intimal thickness of their arteries across their age groups, and then they compared them to a study by Young et al. Of men aged 60 to 69. So the Masai in the 50-year age group have almost similar atherosclerosis or intimal thickness of their arteries, which is a measure of atherosclerosis, as men in their 60s to 69 years old in the US. So their outcomes look arguably a little bit worse in terms of atherosclerosis compared to American men, at least in this Mann et al. Study. And then the last one that we see here is a comparison of the different vessels: the left main, the left anterior descending, the left anterior, left circumflex, and then the right circumflex arteries. The amount of intimal thickness that they see. So we see this line right here where we see that this is from the Young et al. Study for men aged 60 to 69 for all their vessels. The Masai men at age 60 have higher amounts of atherosclerosis than the 60 to 69-year-old men from the US at every single point of their coronary arteries. So they have much higher coronary artery atherosclerosis, at least based on intimal thickness readings, than regular American men. So basically, what we're seeing here with the Masai population is that they actually have quite a bit of atherosclerosis. They have quite a bit of disease here. And the idea that you kind of get, because I remember I had this as well, like when I was doing the low carb stuff, I was like, oh, well, the Masai are healthy. They don't have disease. And it's like, well, actually, they are having disease. They are having atherosclerosis. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily because of their diet in the sense that it's like, oh, the dairy fat is just causing that. But we're seeing an ancestral population that has been used as an example of why we should eat a certain way. And we're seeing a high amount of atherosclerosis in this population. There's a caveat to this analysis that I think is really important and fair to make. This analysis was done on 50 Masai men who had died from age 10 to 60. So you are looking at people who had different infections, different disease processes, etc. And so you may have selected for a population that could have like more would may have been more likely to have atherosclerosis because of some of their disease processes. But either way, you're still seeing extensive atherosclerosis in the population, which I think kind of flies in the face of the idea that this ancestral population was super healthy and didn't have any diseases. Like, no, they actually are having this is a chronic disease that you're seeing. They're just not seeing it in the form of heart attacks. Part of the reason I chose these 50 guys or this Mann study that looked at these 50 men wasn't to be unfair per se. It was just that this was the this was the data that we had, right? This is the best data that we had from the 1970s. There's Masai now that exist in Kenya, and they're able to like you can go and study them, but the diet has shifted compared to these different time frames with the introduction of different foods. So it may muddle some of the water here. So this was one of the best studies that we had with the largest population size and an in-depth look because the Briss et al. Study, there were some problems with it in terms of how they determined atherosclerosis in the men and how they chose their population. Whereas the Mann study is much better overall, larger population, etc. But so you may have that confounding factor in there in terms of the selection of people who are already sick. But the one other thing I want to mention here that's really interesting is the idea that each of us have different degrees of tolerating different dietary components based on our backgrounds. So sometimes it may not make sense to say, hey, like the Masai have this diet and they're healthy, therefore I can do that diet. When we see something like the Masai are able to keep low serum low serum cholesterol values in the face of a really high fat intake, that's a really high saturated fat intake and a really high cholesterol intake as well, that for another population may ramp up those values pretty significantly. And even with that, even despite their low cholesterol intake, they also still had extensive atherosclerosis, at least based on this data. So this is, I think, there's a couple pieces to keep in mind here to bring some nuance to the overarching picture. In contrast to the Masai, the other population we're going to look at here is the Tsimane. And the Tsimane study was more recent, so I can look at just one paper to look at this. And essentially, in this study, they looked at 705 of these Tsimane Native Americans, and the average age of the population was about 57.6 years old. Now, the Tsimane diet is basically almost polar opposite to the Masai. And so I have a quote here. The quote is from the paper Fatty Acid Composition in Mature Milk of Bolivian Forager Horticulturist, Controlled Comparisons with the U.S. Sample. So this was another paper but it gave a better idea of what the Tsimane diet was. And what they say here, from previously gathered population-wide dietary observations, we estimate that for adults aged 20 and older, the average Tsimane diet comprises 74% plant and 26% animal foods. Locally cultivated staples like rice, plantain, cassava, or they say manioc here, and corn account for 66% of total dietary energy. Wild and cultivated fruits and nuts, 6%, and market foods, so crackers, bread, pasta, sugar, 2%. Game meat, primarily species of peccary, tapir, capybara, and monkey, account for 17% of total dietary energy. Freshwater fish, 7%, and beef, poultry, and pork from free-ranging animals, 2%. The Tsimane do not consume domestic milk or dairy products, and eggs accounts for less than 0.5% of the diet. An estimated 14% of average daily energy is derived from fat, 14% from protein, and 72% from carbohydrates. Minimally, the average adult Tsimane diet contains 38 grams of fat per day, with 11 grams saturated fat, 14 grams monounsaturated fat, and 8 grams polyunsaturated fat. So the Tsimane's diet's about 2,400 calories per day. 72% of it's carbohydrates. So that's about 440 grams of carbohydrate per day. Then they have about 14% fat per day, which is 38 grams per day. And they have about 14% protein per day, which is about 85 grams per day. So their protein intake is lower than the Masai. Their fat intake is significantly lower than the Masai. And their carbohydrate intake is massively higher than the Masai. If we compare the two diets, the Masai diet, so you had 183 grams of fat for the Masai versus the 38 grams of fat for the Tsimane. In terms of carbohydrate, the Masai were at 80 grams per day, whereas the Tsimane were at 440 grams per day. and we look at the protein intake, the Masai were about 130 grams per day, and the Tsimane were at 85 grams per day. So it's flipped and largely flipped in terms of carbs and fat composition. Tsimane have a really high carbohydrate intake. Now, one tangent that I want to talk about here, because this is something that goes in the comment section, is that if you can't do a high carb diet in the wild because you can't find a large amount of carbohydrate sources. And that's actually false. And we can see that here where you have a population that is subsisting on a very high carbohydrate intake, 440 grams per day, based on the calculations that we're getting. So even if they're off by, say it's 25 to 30%, you would still see about a 300-gram carbohydrate intake per day, which would still be considered pretty high in general by the low carb standards. So you can actually have a high carbohydrate intake on an ancestral diet. So that's something to keep in mind. It just depends on where you live. If you live in the Amazon rainforest or you live around the equator, you could get a high carbohydrate intake. If you're up in the north, you may have a harder time. So the diets are going to be dependent upon the different population where they're from. That's something to keep in mind here. Now, in terms of the Tsimane's physical characteristics, the Tsimane, I pulled out the table here. The Tsimane in general had this body fat percentage was average, so it was with men and women here. So the Tsimane had a normal body mass index, and they didn't have a high body fat percentage, although their BMI and their body fat percentage was higher than the Masai on average. They had normal blood pressures. There was no hypertension in any of the age groups. And then the Tsimane also had, they didn't actually have perfect lipids. So their ApoB values were, while they were younger, between 40 to about 54 years old, they stayed below the 90 milligram per deciliter target. But as they got older, they actually went over the 90 milligram per deciliter target, where the 55-year-old to 74-year-olds were in the hundreds on their ApoB. And then the 75-year-olds were around 100 as well. So you're seeing a higher ApoB than is considered ideal by traditional cardiology practices. And an ApoA1 was actually lower than what would be considered ideal from like a standard cardiology sense, where you'd really want it closer, at least from some of the research, between 150 and 200 milligrams per deciliter. The other thing is that Tsimane didn't have optimal oxidized LDL levels. So the 40 to 44-year-olds were about 82 units per liter. And then the other age groups were all around in the 70s units per liter. Ideal would be less than 60 units per liter. So their lipid profile was pretty decent, not significantly higher than or lower than the Masai, and the values weren't necessarily optimal. And that's the same thing that goes for some of their inflammatory markers. So most of the Tsimane had inflammatory markers that were significantly higher than what would be considered ideal. So their CRP values for all age groups from 40 to 75 plus years was greater than 3, which is not considered an ideal CRP value. Ideal will be less than 1. And then their ESR values were all greater than 20 millimeters per hour, which ideal would be at least less than 10 for women and ideally less than 5 for men. Plus, they had a higher white blood cell count, and their immune cell counts were higher on average as well because they had multiple parasitic infections in the population. So what we're seeing with the Tsimane, normal BMI, normal blood pressure, lipids that aren't too far off from the Masai. They're about the same, and they're not even ideal lipids, and inflammatory markers that are high. We don't have the inflammatory markers for the Masai, but we had some of the other metrics. So this is so we can compare them back and forth. Now, the Masai were active, but so are the Tsimane. And based on this paper, they say most of a typical Tsimane day involves the physical activity of farming, hunting, food preparation, household chores, and parenting. The average hunt lasts more than 8 hours and covers nearly 18 kilometers, which is like 10 to 11 miles. While horticultural labor includes using metal axes to chop large areas of primary forest, men and women spend a mean of 6 to 7 hours and 4 to 6 hours per day engaging in physical activity, respectively. Less than 10% of the Tsimane daylight hours are spent engaged in sedentary activity, while more than 54% of waking hours are sedentary in industrial populations. So the Tsimane also were quite active. So you couldn't say one population was really massively more active than the other. They both had higher activity levels than your Western populations. And then on top of that, the Tsimane did have large amount of infections. So they say here the Tsimane lack access to clean water, sewage, or electricity. Over 2/3 of the adult population suffer from intestinal helminths at any given time. So 66% of the population has some type of intestinal worm, at least the adult population. And that's not even in this study. What we're going to see is they did coronary artery calcium scans on them. And what they basically found was that some of them also had tuberculosis. So tuberculosis was present, intestinal helminths were present. So there's a lot of infections present in the population. They just kind of live with them over time, which also explains the inflammatory burden that we see in their markers. Now, with the Tsimane, what they did is they went and they did CAC scores on them, so coronary artery calcium scores, to see how much plaque burden they had. And the reason I chose these two populations is because we actually have really good data on their cardiovascular health. With the Masai, you have autopsy data where they basically opened up the hearts and the arteries and saw where the atherosclerosis was. And then for the Tsimane here, they actually did coronary artery calcium scores on living individuals. So, from the paper, what they say here is we observed a very low prevalence of coronary atherosclerosis in the Tsimane as measured by coronary artery calcium scoring. 85%, so 596 of the 705 participants had no coronary artery calcium, zero. Their score was zero. 89 people, 13% of the participants, had a CAC score lower than 100, and only 3% of the participants had a CAC score of 100 or higher. And keep in mind, this is in a population that average age was 57.6 years old. So this is actually really amazing coronary artery calcium scores. And so they give us the graphic here where they compared the Tsimane to the MESA cohort. So the study they did looking at the CAC scores in the US. Um, and basically what you found was on the bottom here we have the different age groups, and then this solid blue line is for the Tsimane. Its CAC score is greater than 100, and then for the red line, solid line is MESA. And what we basically find is that by age 75 to 84, only 8% of the Tsimane population had a CAC score greater than 100. And down even into the 55 to 64 age group, only 2% of the population had a CAC score greater than 100. When we look at the MESA cohort instead, by 75 to 84 years old, 51% of the population had a CAC score greater than 100. And even by 55 to 64 years old, 17% of the MESA cohort had a CAC score greater than 100, which is still twice the amount of coronary artery calcium that we're seeing in 75 to 85-year-olds in the Tsimane group. So essentially, what you're seeing is a significantly higher amount of coronary calcium in the MESA group, and the Tsimane group is exceptionally low. And we actually have comparison to other population. So they go on to say here, the researchers say coronary artery calcium scores are normally 2 to 4 times higher in men than in women. Although Tsimane men had higher CAC scores than Tsimane women, a finding more prominent in the older population, Tsimane men had lower CAC scores than Japanese women, a population previously regarded as having the lowest CAC scores reported of any ethnicity. So when we look at this is a graph comparing the CAC scores of different populations. So you have men on the, or women on the top, men on the bottom, and you have US men, US white men, US black men, US Hispanic men, European men, Korean men, Chinese men, Japanese men, and then Tsimane men. And you have those same groups for the women. And what you find is in both groups, we can see here this little blue line at the absolute bottom. The Tsimane have the lowest CAC scores of all the populations combined. And again, even lower than Japanese women, which were considered to have the lowest level of, or the lowest CAC scores on average of all the groups combined. So we can see that the cardiovascular risk in the Tsimane is massively lower. And this flies in comparison to the Masai, who had basically carotid arterial intimal thickness levels that were comparable to Western men. And the 50-year-olds in the Masai group had atherosclerosis levels that were comparable to 60-year-olds in the West. So it's a big, you have these two diets. You have a really high fat dairy and meat based diet entirely for the Masai to a large extent. And then you have the Tsimane, who they do have meat. It's not a vegan diet, but their diet is higher in carbohydrate. And you have one group that has extensive atherosclerosis, and then you have another group who has the lowest amount of atherosclerosis seen of any population so far. So it's a really huge difference when you look at these two different groups. And again, both of them are hunter-gatherer, ancestrally living populations. So the Tsimane are an example that kind of flies in the face of some of the low carb ideology where it's like, oh, you can't get enough carbs, or these populations that were low carb were super healthy. And I'm gonna make a video on the Eskimos, so that's coming. So basically, you can see the different dynamics here. We get to compare and contrast the populations. I want to make it clear here again, it's not a perfect comparison, right? You only have 50 people with the Masai, where you had 700 people with the Tsimane, and then the Masai individuals were autopsies. These were CACs. So you could have some selection bias based on this. They're not randomized. They're not randomized selection for the participants. So just things to keep in mind. But it's the best data we have right now to compare these different populations. So with that, now that I've showed you the two different ancestral populations, their diets, and their cardiovascular health,